My school counselor thought I was lying about abuse, so I ended up in foster care. The moment I knew my life was over wasn't when my father's belt broke skin for the 100th time. It wasn't when I showed Mrs. Delacroix the welts on my back and watched her face harden into disbelief. It was 3 weeks later, sitting in the back of a state-issued Chevrolet Impala, watching my childhood home shrink in the rearview mirror, while a woman I'd met 45 minutes earlier explained that I'd be staying with a nice family until things got sorted out. I was 14 years old, and I had just learned the most important lesson of my life. Telling the truth doesn't mean anyone will believe you. In fact, sometimes the truth is exactly what destroys you. The social worker's name was Miss Okonkwo, and she kept glancing at me in the mirror with this expression I'd come to know well over the following months. It was pity mixed with suspicion, like she couldn't decide whether I was a victim or a liar. I'd see that look on a lot of faces: teachers, lawyers, foster parents, even the judge who eventually sealed my fate with a single signature. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how a kid trying to escape abuse ended up being punished for reporting it, you need to understand where I came from and why I trusted the one person who should have helped me. I'd been a straight-A student at Westbrook Middle School for 2 years when this nightmare started. My name is Ethan Reyes, and until 8th grade, I was the kind of kid teachers loved. Quiet, respectful, turned in every assignment on time, never caused problems. What they didn't know was that my good behavior wasn't ambition or discipline. It was survival. My father, Raymond Reyes, was a respected accountant at a mid-sized firm downtown. He wore pressed shirts, drove a clean Toyota Camry, and shook hands firmly at parent-teacher conferences. Neighbors called him Ray and borrowed his lawnmower. Nobody saw what happened behind our front door once it closed. My mother had left when I was 6, and I learned early not to ask about her. The one time I did, I couldn't sit comfortably for a week. After that, she became a ghost. I learned to stop mourning. My father's rules were simple and absolute: maintain appearances, excel academically, never speak about family matters to outsiders. Breaking any rule meant consequences. The belt was his preferred tool, but he was creative when he needed to be. Ice baths for cooling down after I showed emotion. Standing in the corner of the garage for hours in winter because I'd forgotten to take out the trash. Once, when I was 12, he made me hold a dictionary above my head for 3 hours because I'd gotten a B+ on a history test. The abuse followed a pattern I could almost predict. Mondays and Thursdays were the most dangerous because those were the days he reviewed my schoolwork. Weekends were unpredictable, depending on whether he'd been drinking. I learned to read his moods the way meteorologists read weather systems, always watching for signs of the coming storm. I knew that when his jaw tightened a certain way, I needed to disappear. When he started drumming his fingers on the kitchen table, I should already be in my room with the door locked. Not that locks ever stopped him. He had keys to every door in the house, and using them was just another form of control. "Privacy is earned," he'd say, standing in my doorway at midnight for no reason other than to remind me I had none. I developed insomnia by age 11. I taught myself to sleep lightly, to wake at the slightest creak of the floorboards. My body learned to survive before my mind understood what survival meant. By 8th grade, I had a collection of scars I'd gotten skilled at hiding. Long sleeves in summer, careful excuses about sports injuries I never actually sustained, a rehearsed laugh when anyone got too close to asking the right questions. Mrs. Delacroix had been the school counselor at Westbrook for 16 years. She had a wall full of certificates and a reputation for being the kind of adult kids could trust. I'd heard other students talk about how she'd helped them through divorces, bullying, even a few situations involving abuse at home. Her office had a couch with soft pillows and a bowl of butterscotch candies on her desk. When she looked at you, she really seemed to listen. Or at least, that's what I thought before I became the exception to her compassion. It was early October, 3 weeks into 8th grade, when everything started to unravel. We'd had a substitute PE teacher that day, someone who didn't know the rules I'd established with Coach Yamamoto about changing in the private bathroom stall. The substitute insisted everyone change in the open locker room. "No special treatment," he'd said. I tried to angle my body toward the corner, but another student, Kevin Ostrowski, saw the marks on my back before I could pull my shirt down. His eyes went wide. "Dude, what happened to you?" I mumbled something about a dirt bike accident, but Kevin wasn't stupid. The marks weren't scrapes or bruises from a fall. They were precise parallel lines where a belt had been applied with deliberate force. By the end of the day, I was sitting in Mrs. Delacroix's office. She started off exactly how I'd hoped she would. Gentle voice, concerned eyes, a promise that I could tell her anything and she would help. "Ethan, some of your classmates mentioned they saw some concerning marks on your back," she said, pushing the candy bowl toward me like I was a puppy she was trying to coax out from under a porch. "Can you tell me what happened?" I don't know what made me finally talk. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the way she seemed so genuinely caring, so different from every other adult who'd looked right through my pain for years. Or maybe I was just tired of carrying the secret alone, tired of protecting a man who had never protected me. So I told her. I told her about the belt, the ice baths, the hours of standing punishment. I told her about the time my father had slammed my hand in a door because I'd accidentally broken a glass. I showed her the small scar on my palm where I'd needed stitches, which he'd explained to the ER doctor as a kitchen accident. I told her everything, and when I was finished, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. She was taking notes. She was nodding. She was going to help me. Then she asked the question that changed everything. Ethan, is there anyone who can verify what you're telling me? A neighbor? A relative? Anyone who's witnessed this? I felt the hope begin to drain. The problem with my father was his perfection. He never left witnesses. He never hit me where it would show during normal activities. He timed his punishments for when neighbors were at work or asleep. Our house had no security cameras, no nosy relatives dropping by, no evidence except my word against his. When I explained this to Mrs. Delacroix, I watched her expression change. It was subtle, but I caught it. A slight tightening around her eyes, a pursing of her lips, the almost imperceptible shift in her body language that signaled doubt. Well, she said slowly, I'm required to report this. A caseworker from Child Protective Services will need to speak with you and your father. But Ethan, I want you to understand something. She leaned forward, and her voice dropped to something that was supposed to sound confidential, but felt more like a warning. False accusations are very serious. They can destroy families. They can also have consequences for the person making them. I just need you to be absolutely certain that what you're telling me is the complete truth. Something inside me went cold. I was telling the truth. I had shown her the marks on my back. And yet here she was, already questioning me, already laying the groundwork for doubt. The CPS investigation that followed was a masterclass in institutional failure. The caseworker assigned to my case was a man named Douglas Porter, a tired-looking 40-something with a caseload so heavy I later learned he was juggling over 50 active files simultaneously. He arrived at our house on a Thursday evening, gave my father advance notice of his visit, and spent exactly 38 minutes assessing our home. I know the exact time because I watched the clock the entire time, waiting for someone to finally see the truth. But my father was ready. The house was immaculate. My room looked like a catalog photo, complete with books on my shelf and a bedspread I'd never seen before. My father greeted Mr. Porter with a firm handshake and an expression of bewildered concern. I have no idea why Ethan would say these things, he said, his voice trembling with manufactured emotion. I've tried so hard to be a good father since his mother abandoned us. Maybe he's struggling with something at school? Some kind of emotional issue? Mr. Porter nodded sympathetically and made notes. When he asked to see my back, the marks had faded enough that he described them in his report as faint discoloration, consistent with minor childhood roughhousing. He never asked me about the ice baths or the standing punishments. He never questioned why I flinched every time my father shifted in his chair. The interview with Mr. Porter lasted about 15 minutes. He asked me the same questions Mrs. Delacroix had asked, and I gave him the same answers. But this time, I could feel my father's presence in the next room, could practically hear him controlling the narrative even from a distance. When Mr. Porter asked if I wanted to modify any of my statements, I felt something break inside me. He wasn't asking because he thought I might have forgotten something. He was giving me a chance to recant, to admit I'd been lying, to make his job easier by turning this into a case he could close without further investigation. I refused to change my story. 2 weeks later, I received the consequences of my stubbornness. The CPS report concluded that my allegations were unsubstantiated and that I displayed possible signs of oppositional defiance and attention-seeking behavior. Mrs. Delacroix's notes were attached, including her observation that I had failed to provide corroborating evidence, and that my story remained suspiciously consistent across multiple tellings. Suspiciously consistent. Let that sink in. Telling the same story the same way because it was the truth was being used as evidence that I was lying. My father's response to the investigation was swift and calculated. Within 3 days of the report being filed, he had me in the office of Dr. Kathleen Brennan, a child psychologist whose business relied heavily on family court referrals. She diagnosed me with adjustment disorder with disturbance of conduct, after 2 sessions lasting a combined 90 minutes. Her report described me as potentially manipulative, with difficulty distinguishing between reality and desired outcomes. She recommended ongoing therapy and noted that adolescents sometimes fabricate or exaggerate claims when seeking attention or attempting to manipulate custody situations. When I pointed out that there was no custody situation because my mother was gone, Dr. Brennan just nodded and wrote something in her notebook. I never found out what. Armed with this diagnosis and the unsubstantiated CPS report, my father filed a petition with family court claiming he could no longer safely care for me due to my behavioral issues and false accusations. He presented himself as a concerned parent at the end of his rope, a single father who had sacrificed everything for a child who repaid him with lies. The judge, Honorable William Foster, reviewed the paperwork in a hearing that lasted exactly 23 minutes. I wasn't allowed to speak. My court-appointed attorney, a woman named Lisa Chang, who I'd met for the first time that morning, advised me to stay quiet and let her handle it. She didn't handle it. She barely glanced at me during the entire hearing, shuffling papers and checking her phone, while my fate was decided by people who had never bothered to actually listen to me. Judge Foster ruled that I would be placed in temporary foster care while family reunification services were arranged. In other words, the system's solution to my report of abuse was to remove me from my home, label me as a problem child, and then plan to send me right back to my abuser once he completed some parenting classes. I remember the exact moment the judge signed the order. It was 3:47 in the afternoon on October 31st. The day was overcast, gray light filtering through the courtroom windows. Somewhere outside, other kids were preparing for trick-or-treating, worrying about candy and costumes. I was watching a stranger in a black robe hand my life to a system that had already decided I was the villain in my own story. My father didn't look at me as the bailiff led me out of the courtroom. He was too busy shaking hands with his lawyer, a man named Richard Thornberry, who specialized in custody disputes and charged $400 an hour. I'd overheard them talking in the hallway before the hearing, discussing strategy, joking about how easy this case was going to be. The first foster home was the Kellys, a couple in their mid-50s who had been taking in children for 12 years. Margaret Kelly was a retired nurse, and her husband Franklin had worked in insurance before an early retirement. On paper, they seemed perfect. Their home was clean, their references were solid, and they had an approved capacity for 3 foster children. I was their second placement at the time, joining a 9-year-old girl named Destiny, who barely spoke and spent most of her time drawing in a corner of the living room. The Kellys weren't cruel, but they weren't kind either. They ran their home like a boarding house, with strict schedules and minimal emotional investment. Breakfast at 7, dinner at 6, lights out at 9, no television on weeknights, chores assigned by a rotating chart on the refrigerator. Mrs. Kelly called me the new one for the first 3 weeks, as if learning my name wasn't worth the effort until she was sure I'd stick around. I slept in a room that had clearly been decorated for a much younger child, with faded dinosaur wallpaper and a twin bed that sagged in the middle. My belongings fit in a single garbage bag that the social worker had helped me pack before leaving my father's house. My caseworker at this point was no longer Douglas Porter. He had transferred to a different department, and my file was handed off to a woman named Teresa Kovac, who seemed slightly more competent but equally overworked. She visited me once a week for the first month, asking the same checklist questions and making notes in her tablet. Was I attending school? Yes. Was I taking any medications? No. Did I feel safe in the foster home? I didn't know how to answer that question. Safe from what? I felt safe from my father, at least physically. But I also felt like I was drowning, like every day was just another step toward being sent back to him once the system decided I'd been sufficiently stabilized. The school situation was its own nightmare. I'd been transferred to a new school in the Kellys district, which meant leaving behind the few acquaintances I'd had at Westbrook. The new school, Lincoln Heights Middle, treated me with the particular brand of casual cruelty reserved for foster kids. Teachers regarded me with suspicion. Classmates knew I was in the system because the school counselor, apparently unaware of confidentiality, had mentioned it to a student aide who spread it through the gossip network within hours. I developed a new survival strategy: invisibility. I stopped raising my hand in class, stopped making eye contact in the hallways, stopped trying to connect with anyone. My grades, which had always been excellent, began to slip. Not because I couldn't do the work, but because I no longer saw the point. What was I achieving good grades for? A future that felt like it had already been stolen from me? An escape route that kept getting pulled further away? My father, meanwhile, was playing his role perfectly. He attended his court-ordered parenting classes, submitted to random home visits, and sent me letters through the system's official channels. The letters were masterpieces of manipulation. Dear Ethan, I'm so sorry for whatever I did to make you feel like you had to say those things. I'm working hard to be a better father. I love you, and I can't wait until we can be a family again. The letters were reviewed by my caseworker, who noted them as evidence of his commitment to reunification. No one saw them for what they really were: a predator biding his time, performing contrition while planning his next move. I kept every letter in a folder under my mattress, not because they meant anything to me, but because I needed to remember what I was up against. The turning point came about 3 months into my placement with the Kellys. I was in the kitchen doing dishes after dinner when Franklin Kelly came in to get a beer from the refrigerator. He stood behind me for a moment, not saying anything, and I felt every muscle in my body tense in recognition. I knew that feeling. That presence of someone standing too close, waiting for something. You know, he said quietly, Margaret thinks you're doing better, but I'm not so sure. His hand landed on my shoulder, and I went absolutely still. It wasn't a threatening touch, not yet, but it was familiar in a way that made my stomach drop. I knew what was coming. I had learned to recognize the preamble to abuse the way other kids learn to recognize the signs of an approaching storm. You're a good-looking kid, he continued, his voice dropping even lower. Probably too pretty for your own good. That's probably why you made up those stories about your dad. Wanted attention. I didn't move. I barely breathed. This was a test, I told myself. Maybe I was misreading the situation. Maybe he was just being awkward. But when his hand slid from my shoulder down to the small of my back, I knew. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in my sagging bed with the dinosaur wallpaper, staring at the ceiling and trying to figure out what to do. If I reported Franklin Kelly, what would happen? The same thing that happened when I reported my father. No one would believe me. I'd be labeled as a serial accuser, a kid who made up stories about every adult male in his life. Dr. Brennan's diagnosis would be confirmed. I'd be sent somewhere worse, probably a group home for troubled youth, where I'd be warehoused until I aged out of the system. But if I stayed silent, I knew what would happen. Franklin would push further. Men like him always did. They tested boundaries, waited for resistance, and when none came, they took what they wanted. I was 14 years old, alone in a system that had already decided I was a liar, and I was facing the same impossible choice that countless foster kids face every single day: suffer in silence or speak up and be punished for it. The next morning, I made my decision. I packed my garbage bag, waited until the Kellys were both in the kitchen eating breakfast, and walked out the front door. I didn't leave a note. I didn't say goodbye to Destiny, though I felt guilty about leaving her there. I just walked until I couldn't see the house anymore. Running from a foster placement is a serious offense. I knew that. But I also knew that staying in that house was not something I could survive. I walked for about 3 miles before a police cruiser pulled up beside me. The officer who stepped out was a woman named Sergeant Diana Cortez, a 15-year veteran of the force who specialized in youth services. She didn't handcuff me or lecture me or treat me like a criminal. She bought me a breakfast sandwich from a gas station and sat with me in the cruiser while I ate it, not asking questions, just waiting. Finally, she said, "You want to tell me why you're walking down a highway at 7 in the morning with a garbage bag full of clothes?" I told her about Franklin Kelly. I told her about the way he touched me, the things he said. I told her about my father, about Mrs. Delacroix, about the CPS investigation that went nowhere, about the psychologist who labeled me a liar without ever actually listening. Sergeant Cortez took notes. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something no adult had ever said to me before. "I believe you." Those 3 words hit me harder than my father's belt ever had. I started crying, something I hadn't allowed myself to do in years, and Sergeant Cortez just sat there, letting me fall apart in the passenger seat of her cruiser without trying to fix it or rush me along. Sergeant Cortez drove me to the station, where she made a series of phone calls that would eventually change everything. She contacted my caseworker, Teresa Kovacs, and demanded an emergency placement review. She filed a formal report about Franklin Kelly, including my allegations and her own observations about my demeanor. Most importantly, she connected me with someone who would become the first real advocate I'd ever had, a child welfare attorney named David Okonkwo. David was 34 years old, a former foster kid himself, and he worked for a nonprofit legal organization that specialized in representing children in the foster care system. When he walked into the interview room where I'd been waiting for 4 hours, he didn't shake my hand or introduce himself with a title. He just sat down across from me and said, "I've read your file. You've been failed by every adult who was supposed to help you. That stops today." I didn't know whether to laugh or cry, so I did neither. I just stared at him, waiting for the catch, waiting for him to reveal that he was just like all the others. But David Okonkwo was different. Over the next several weeks, David dismantled my case piece by piece. He obtained the original CPS report and highlighted every procedural violation. The advance notice given to my father before the home visit, the inadequate interview time with me, the failure to photograph my injuries or consult with medical professionals. He subpoenaed Dr. Brennan's records and discovered that she had been sanctioned twice by the state licensing board for questionable diagnoses in custody disputes. He interviewed the substitute PE teacher who had first exposed my injuries and got a sworn statement confirming that the marks on my back were consistent with deliberate physical abuse, not childhood roughhousing. He tracked down a former colleague of my father's who had witnessed him lose his temper at a work event and make threatening comments about discipline at home. Most crucially, David found my mother. Her name was Elena Reyes, and she hadn't abandoned me. She had been forced out by my father, who had threatened to kill her if she ever tried to contact me. She had been living in Arizona for 8 years, working as a hotel manager, attending therapy, and waiting for an opportunity to find me again. When David told me this, I couldn't process it. My entire childhood had been built on the lie that my mother had chosen to leave me, that I was unworthy of her love. That lie had been another form of my father's abuse, and David had just shattered it. While David was building my case, Sergeant Cortez was conducting her own investigation into Franklin Kelly. She discovered that he had a previous complaint filed against him by a former foster child, a complaint that had been dismissed due to insufficient evidence. She interviewed that child, now a 19-year-old woman named Mia Vasquez, who described experiences almost identical to mine: the lingering touches, the inappropriate comments, the gradual escalation that had only stopped when she aged out of the system and escaped. Mia had never reported the abuse because she knew no one would believe her. She was a foster kid with a troubled history, and Franklin Kelly was a respected member of the community. But she agreed to give a statement now, and her testimony corroborated my allegations in ways that couldn't be dismissed as coincidence. The investigation expanded. Sergeant Cortez brought in 2 other detectives, and together they built a case against Franklin Kelly that would eventually result in his arrest for child endangerment and sexual abuse. He was taken into custody on a Thursday morning, exactly 4 months after I had walked out of his house with a garbage bag full of clothes. Mrs. Delacroix was next. David filed a formal complaint with the school district, documenting her failure to properly investigate my abuse allegations and her prejudicial notes that had been used to discredit me in family court. The complaint triggered an internal investigation that revealed a pattern of similar behavior. Other students who had reported abuse and been subtly discouraged or disbelieved, other cases where her notes had been used by accused parents to avoid consequences. The school board placed her on administrative leave pending a full review, and the local newspaper picked up the story. The headline read, "School counselor accused of failing multiple abuse victims. Mrs. Delacroix hired a lawyer and gave a statement claiming she had always followed proper protocols, that she was being unfairly targeted by disgruntled former students." But the evidence spoke louder than her excuses. 6 other families came forward with similar experiences, and the school district eventually settled with them for undisclosed amounts. Mrs. Delacroix resigned rather than face termination. Last I heard, she was working at a private tutoring center in another state, her 16-year career in school counseling reduced to ashes. My father's turn came in the spring. Armed with the evidence David had gathered, the district attorney's office reopened the investigation into my abuse allegations. This time, the investigation was handled by Detective Marcus Webb, a 22-year veteran of the Special Victims Unit who specialized in child abuse cases. Detective Webb conducted a thorough examination of my medical records and found documentation of multiple injuries over the years that my father had explained away as accidents. A broken wrist when I was 9, attributed to falling off my bike. A burn on my arm at 11, blamed on a cooking mishap. A pattern of bruises and abrasions that, when viewed together, painted a picture of systematic physical abuse. Detective Webb also obtained phone records that showed my father had made multiple calls to Dr. Brennan before and after her evaluation of me, calls that violated professional ethics and suggested a coordinated effort to discredit me. Dr. Brennan's license was subsequently suspended pending investigation. But the most damaging evidence came from an unexpected source: my father's girlfriend. Her name was Catherine Monroe, and she had been dating my father for about 6 months at the time of his arrest. Catherine was a schoolteacher, a kind woman who had no idea about my father's history when she started seeing him. She came forward after reading about the investigation in the newspaper, troubled by things she had witnessed but had initially dismissed. She described an evening when my father had drunk too much wine and made comments about how children needed firm discipline to build character. She described finding a box in his closet containing a collection of belts, some with stains that she now suspected were blood. Most importantly, she provided the one piece of evidence that finally broke the case wide open: a recording she had made on her phone during an argument with my father, an argument in which he had admitted to hitting me and justified it as necessary correction. The recording was authenticated by forensic audio experts and entered into evidence. My father was arrested on multiple counts of aggravated child abuse and endangerment. He was denied bail due to flight risk concerns and the severity of the charges. For the first time in my life, he was locked in a room he couldn't control. The trial took place in the fall, almost exactly a year after I had first sat in Mrs. Delacroix's office and told the truth. I testified for 3 hours, describing years of abuse in detail that left several jurors visibly shaken. David had prepared me for the defense attorney's cross-examination, warning me that they would try to portray me as a liar, as disturbed, as seeking revenge for being placed in foster care. He was right. The defense attorney, a woman named Patricia Holloway, questioned my memory, my motivations, my psychological state. She brought up Dr. Brennan's diagnosis and suggested that I was exactly the kind of troubled teen who would fabricate stories for attention. But I had learned something important over the past year. Telling the truth isn't the same as being believed. You have to fight for belief. You have to make people see. So when Patricia Holloway asked me why anyone should believe my version of events, I looked directly at the jury and said, "Because I have the scars to prove it." Then I removed my shirt, right there in the courtroom, and showed them the marks my father had left on my body. Marks that had finally been photographed, documented, and authenticated by medical professionals. Marks that told a story no amount of legal maneuvering could erase. The jury deliberated for 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. My father was sentenced to 12 years in state prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 8. Judge Margaret Thornton, who presided over the criminal trial, read a statement during sentencing that I still have memorized. This case represents a catastrophic failure of the systems designed to protect vulnerable children. The defendant exploited every loophole, manipulated every process, and relied on the inherent bias against child accusers to continue his abuse unchecked. He did so with the unwitting assistance of professionals who should have known better. This court hopes that the sentence imposed today sends a clear message. Children who speak up about abuse deserve to be heard, believed, and protected. I didn't cry when the verdict was read. I didn't cry when the sentence was announced. I had spent so long learning not to show emotion that I wasn't sure how to anymore. But that night, in the new foster home where I'd been placed with a genuinely caring family named the Ortizes, I finally let myself feel what I'd been holding back for years. I cried until I couldn't breathe, and Maria Ortiz held me without asking questions, without offering platitudes, without trying to fix anything. She just let me grieve for the childhood I'd never had and the father I'd never really known. My mother came back into my life gradually, the way a slowly healing wound eventually becomes a scar. We started with supervised visits, then phone calls, then overnight stays at her apartment in Arizona. She was different from the ghost I'd imagined for so many years. Sadder, but also stronger. She told me about the years she'd spent trying to find legal ways to reach me, the restraining orders my father had filed against her, the letters she'd sent that never arrived because he intercepted them. She showed me a box under her bed containing every birthday card she'd written me for 8 years, cards I'd never received, each one addressed to a son she wasn't sure she'd ever see again. We're still rebuilding our relationship. It's not easy. There are years of damage that can't be undone with apologies or explanations, trust that has to be earned one day at a time. But for the first time in my life, I have a mother who fights for me instead of against me, who believes me without requiring proof, who loves me without conditions or contingencies. Franklin Kelly was convicted of 3 counts of sexual abuse and is currently serving 15 years in prison. His wife Margaret divorced him shortly after his arrest and moved out of state. The other children who had been placed in their home were relocated to safer environments, and I heard that Destiny, the quiet girl who spent all her time drawing, was eventually adopted by a family who specialized in helping traumatized children heal. Mrs. Delacroix never faced criminal charges, but she lost everything that mattered to her career, her reputation, her standing in the community. The last time her name appeared in the news, it was in connection with a civil lawsuit filed by one of the families she'd failed. Dr. Brennan had her license permanently revoked after the investigation revealed multiple instances of falsifying diagnoses for parents involved in custody disputes. She was fined $200,000 and prohibited from ever practicing psychology in any state. Douglas Porter, the caseworker who conducted the inadequate initial investigation of my abuse, was quietly transferred to a different department. The system protected its own, even when they failed spectacularly. But David Okonkwo filed a complaint that eventually led to policy changes in how CPS investigates abuse allegations, including mandatory training on recognizing coached statements and increased documentation requirements. I'm 17 now, living with the Ortiz family until I turn 18, at which point I plan to move to Arizona to be closer to my mother. I've gotten my grades back up, though school will never be the same for me. I see a therapist twice a week, someone David helped me find, a woman named Dr. Christina Fairbanks, who specializes in childhood trauma and actually listens instead of looking for reasons to disbelieve. I've started volunteering with an organization that provides support to foster children navigating the legal system, helping kids the way David and Sergeant Cortez helped me. It's not much, but it feels like taking something broken and turning it into something useful. My father sends letters from prison sometimes. I don't read them. I don't need his apologies or explanations or excuses. I don't need anything from him anymore. The last time I saw him was in that courtroom, watching the bailiff lead him away in handcuffs, watching his perfect mask finally crack as the reality of consequences set in. He looked at me as they took him out, and for the first time I saw something in his eyes besides control. I saw fear. It was the same fear I'd felt my entire childhood, and seeing it reflected back at me was the closest thing to justice I ever needed. People ask me sometimes whether I regret speaking up, given everything it cost me. The foster homes, the disbelief, the labels, the months of my life swallowed by a system that treated me as the problem instead of the solution. And honestly, I don't know. Some days I think about what would have happened if I'd stayed quiet, kept my head down, endured another 4 years until I turned 18 and could escape on my own terms. Maybe I would have been fine. Maybe the abuse would have gotten worse. Maybe my father would have eventually killed me. Or maybe I would have done something to myself just to make it stop. I'll never know. What I do know is that every kid who speaks up about abuse makes it a little easier for the next one. Every case that exposes institutional failure forces the system to get a little better. Every adult who chooses to believe a child over their own assumptions helps create a world where children like me don't have to fight so hard just to be heard. I fought because I had no other choice. But maybe someday, because of what I went through, some other kid won't have to fight quite as hard. If you made it this far, hit like, you've earned it.